So this is the third part of the cardiovascular drug chapter. And in this section, we're going to cover two distinct types of drugs that we use sometimes together, quite often together with other drugs that we have previously talked about. In particular, the inodilators, pimobendan, to help with heart disease and help with the clinical signs of heart disease. So the first type are vasodilators, and vasodilators help in a very basic way. They help with making it easier for a diseased heart to push blood around the body, and they do that by increasing the diameter of the blood vessels. And doing that just makes it easier to push the blood around in the body by a sick heart or weak heart. And then the second type of drugs we're going to talk about are diuretics. Some people call these water pills. What they're used for is to decrease the amount of fluid in the body. And this again helps to a weak heart if it has less blood volume to push around in the body. um, it will make it easier. Now, hopefully for that heart to work, hopefully this diagram looks very familiar to you. So you all should have been, if you, in your Anatomy 2 class, you will be looking at the nephron so of the kidney. So if you are not concurrently taking Anatomy 2, you'll want to brush up on your nephron anatomy. Okay, but first we're going to start with vasodilators. In order to talk about vasodilators, we need to talk about vasoconstriction and vasodilation. We're going to talk about the renin-angiotensin system. Again, that hopefully should look familiar to you. If not, get out your anatomy book and have a look at that. The drugs we're going to talk about in this particular section are amlodipine and hydralazine, nitroglycerin, nitroprusside, and ACE inhibitors. And again, I want to urge you in your pharmacology book to look at that box at the end of the chapter that lists the drugs that are covered in the chapter, and kind of get those organized, whether you do flashcards or however you want to do it, into those different categories. So that is on page 139, and it lists the various vasodilator drugs. You need to be familiar with the names of those drugs and the diuretics, and you'll need to be familiar with those. But again, we're going to focus for the moment on vasodilators. So vasodilators, let me move my little frame here. Vasodilators. Let's think about the possible causes for a drop in blood pressure. So we can have things like hemorrhage and dehydration, but also if we have a weak, failing heart that's just not able to pump blood very forcefully through the vasculature, we're going to get a drop in blood pressure. So when that happens, there are baroreceptors, and these baroreceptors in the blood vessels, especially the large blood vessels, are constantly monitoring blood pressure, and they are constantly inhibiting the sympathetic nervous system. So they're kind of acting by not causing a reaction. They're saying, hey, sympathetic nervous system, we don't need you to be very active right now because we have sufficient blood pressure. But when the blood pressure drops, that's when those baroreceptors signal to the adrenal glands to release our neurotransmitters of the sympathetic nervous system, which are epinephrine and norepinephrine. Hopefully you thought of those, to help us get that blood pressure back up. There's some other ways that we increase blood pressure. The body increases and tries to compensate for a weak heart that's in congestive heart failure. And the sympathetic nervous system is one of them, but there's another one that will come into play. And so our drugs address these different mechanisms. So I've just talked about the autonomic nervous system that's stimulated with a drop in blood pressure. It is the sympathetic nervous system side. And by doing that, it's going to stimulate, so those neurotransmitters, epinephrine and norepinephrine, are going to stimulate beta 1 receptors. That's going to cause an increase in the heart rate and an increase in the force of contractility of the heart. So we're going to pump blood around a little faster and a little more forcefully when those beta 1 receptors. So then we also have the alpha 1s, those receptors in the sympathetic nervous system, are going to cause vasoconstriction of the peripheral vasculature and also will affect renal perfusion. So renal perfusion, we start to get a decrease in renal perfusion because we don't want to send as much blood through the kidneys. Think about why we might not want to do that as you're looking at this little dog adopting this weird posture to pee on the street. Who knows what this picture is about? But anyway, this little dog is doing that. That is tied to why we want to decrease renal perfusion. So, when we have a decrease in renal perfusion, it's going to, we're going to start into another group of actions that happens to help increase the blood pressure, and that is the RAS, or the renin-angiotensin system. So the first thing it's going to do, that's why I had the little picture of the dog, is to decrease urine formation. If we don't have as much blood going through the kidneys, we're not going to have as much urine produced. And when those renal tubule cells detect that there's less urine formation, we're going to get renin released from the kidney. So the liver releases angiotensin, and renin combined with that is going to produce angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1, as it is circulating through the body, once it's released back into the bloodstream, it's going to, as it goes through the lungs, it's going to interact with angiotensin converting enzyme, and that converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2, hopefully you know why angiotensin 2 is so important. And it has to do with this diagram showing you vasoconstriction. So vasoconstriction is, angiotensin 2 is a very potent vasoconstrictor in the body. So that vasoconstriction is really important, and angiotensin 2 is very important because that vasoconstriction, now we're going to increase the blood pressure. The sympathetic nervous system responding to that low blood pressure, this is what it's trying to do. It's trying to constrict blood vessels so that we get an increase in blood pressure. We have smaller diameter blood vessels. We're pushing that blood through. It's harder to push it through, which increases the blood pressure, but that also makes more work on the heart. So for a short amount of time, that's compensating the low blood pressure, but the congestive heart failure in general, but that's dangerous long term to an animal because it's forcing the the heart to push against greater pressure. So in addition, that angiotensin 2 causes the release of aldosterone from the adrenal glands. And aldosterone in turn causes a problem with congestive heart failure too. Do you remember what aldosterone does? Okay, this is kind of tying it all together. Aldosterone causes sodium retention in the distal convoluted tubule of the nephron. And that sodium retention causes water retention. So we decrease the amount of urine. So not only are we decreasing it, let's go back to the top, we're decreasing it because of that sympathetic nervous system stimulation on the alpha-1 receptors, which is causing less blood flow to go into the kidneys to begin with. So we're going to have less urine formation. But then we activate the renin-angiotensin system. So that's going to cause down here, when angiotensin 2 is produced, vasoconstriction. So now we've got even further constriction of the blood vessels. And then that's going to cause the release of aldosterone. And that is going to cause sodium and water retention. So now we have more fluid retained. And the end result of that is more blood retained and more fluid in the body, and the vasoconstriction, those together are going to cause the heart to have to work hard against that resistance and all of that blood and fluid that's retained in the body. So those things, in a normal heart, that wouldn't necessarily, if we just have dehydration, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem in the short term, because hopefully the animal becomes rehydrated. But in a heart failure heart, that is going to cause a lot of work, and eventually that heart is not going to be able to function well in that environment. We get decompensated congestive heart failure, and eventually the heart will fail, and the animal may die.